next generation of board leaders. So I'm very thrilled today to have our guest, Kristina Veaco. Chris is the founder of Veaco Group. They are a corporate governance consulting firm. She and her team provide practical corporate governance and consulting services to public, private, and also to nonprofit entities. This includes pension funds and their boards. The Veaco Group also specializes in providing independent board evaluations and skill assessments, government audits, and other governance solutions to improve board effectiveness. Prior to forming Veaco Group, Chris advised public companies on securities law compliance and corporate governance as in-house corporate secretaries counsel. And Securities Counsel. And most recently, Chris ran the Office of the Corporate Secretary for McKesson Corporation, a Fortune 15 company. So she's got lots of great experience. I met Chris briefly at a conference. You can learn more about Chris and her team at www.veacogroup.com. California. Good morning and welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm happy to be here.
So before we begin with Chris, I do want to remind everybody that the contents of the slides that we're going to be using today are going to be available for download. Also, the entire webinar will be available for download. If you are joining late, you'll be able to listen to it in its entirety. Also, I please encourage us when we get
Sure, Paul. Thanks very much. About how best boards are made and who may be next in line to join boards as the current members roll off the boards or as new members are added to refresh an existing board. Or maybe you're just trying. Boards need to be responsible for their own composition and their own effectiveness, and I think it's important to talk about how they do that. And there's also an increased focus boardroom by outside stakeholders like investors or regulators, beneficiaries or donors, which causes the board members themselves to think about how they have the right members and whether their practices stand up to scrutiny. And these same stakeholders are looking.
So, Chris, you mentioned the board's being composition and effectiveness. Can you first talk a little bit about board member obligations, and then could you
for a moment in the state where the organization is. And of course, you probably all know about board members' fiduciary obligations, including the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. And if different kinds of organizations will express the fiduciary obligations. And board members are obligated to do what's in the best interest of the organization and its stockholders, if it's a public, beneficiaries, if it's the pension plan, for example. And that really includes making sure the board itself is functioning well. And are they equipped to deal with the issues facing the organization? You know, board effectiveness doesn't just happen. Just because you have smart people on the board, they really have to be able to evaluate their own effectiveness and whether they have the right composition. And, you know, investors want to know what boards are doing to ensure their own effectiveness and that they have. We see public company proxy statements starting to include information on the board evaluation process. This is new, but it's and also including skills matrices. So, you know, to help investors understand what it is that their board members bring. Bottom line here, though, is that companies change and the strategies change, and boards sometimes need to change with them, either by adding particular expertise or moving an unproductive board member off the board that ultimately results in improved board effectiveness. It requires many fronts and that attention be paid to this on a regular basis.
So, Chris, boards needing to change as the organization. Can you be more specific? What does that look like?
Well, I mean, I think that boards need to be looking at them pretty regularly through their board evaluations, through conducting a skills assessment, and then identifying any additional. And I'm not suggesting that we have experts, for example, but you can add people with particular backgrounds that can add to the conversation once skills. And this is all tied to the company's strategy. What's the current strategy and based on that expertise you have on the board and what might you be missing. Also would say that personal characteristics are relevant to the process, and so if will it be a good fit with the existing board? My colleague and I worked with the board very recently on a skills assessment. A couple of times from the board members is when they had some retirements coming up and they were thinking about what to look for when adding some new members. The idea of adding a cordial disruptor, someone who would challenge management and the board, but in a really appropriate way, and get them all to be more creative in their thinking. Many boards, particularly nonprofit boards, haven't really institutionalized a comprehensive process for maintaining this. Or when they've got a vacancy, they may still turn to their friends and say, well, who do you know who could, be on our board, rather than going through a process to determine what the board needs. Some board members just may need some additional education to keep their existing skills high and out of a board evaluation, and then the company can help, get whatever sort of educational opportunities make them. My friend Denise Kuprionis really recently did a webinar in this series with you all, and she discussed skills matrices and even provided an example of. You can see examples in a company's proxy statements these days, as I mentioned, with the skills and competencies that each company and each board believe is important for that board, which is really a great exercise. And one that should be reviewed regularly. It's a living document. Go as the strategy changes. This needs to be reevaluated, and I think it's really foundational to the conversation need or want on the board.
So, quick reminder right now, we've had some more people join the webinar. All the content will be available later date, as well as a replay of the webinar. Also, we're encouraging questions. You can enter them in the dialog box that's there on your screen. Please ask us for answers. So, Chris, not always, but traditionally, we've seen boards composed of members who've been directors for years. So it sounds like you're actually advocating a more fluid board composition. Is that correct?
It's to be, as you say, Paul, that board members would join and be there for a long time, but it's, directorships aren't for life. It's not necessarily advocating it, but this is what we see. A director I know recently commented that the speed of business today has changed what's required. And another director, and this fellow is down in Silicon Valley, but he recently said he wakes up each morning asking himself if he and his fellow board members are leadership that the company needs right now. And I found that attitude really refreshing. It's not that you want a revolving door for your directors, because you want people to be really committed to the board, but if somebody doesn't feel he or she is adding to the conversation or that they've given all that they can to the board, it may be time to bring in some new, fresh perspectives to the board. It's really about what does the business or organization need from its board members right now. And may recognize the importance of CEO succession planning and looking at the CEO's performance, but they don't always recognize that they have a responsibility, their own self-renewal, board succession planning. In other words, boards really need to be proactive and to be prepared and anticipate, not just react.
So, Chris, I have a question. So,
Sure.
not all the board members may recognize this need for refreshment, right? What's the best way to initiate that?
Well, if there is a governance committee or a nominating and governance committee, that might be the place to start. And if there's a corporate secretary, one of the responsibilities of a corporate secretary is to help apprised of governance trends and what are best practices these days and what's going on in the governance world. And so that secretary can sort of raise it or talk about best practices, and what's going to depend on the nature of the organization and how they're structured, whether there's an easy, again, having objective processes, but like a board evaluation, begin the conversation. It doesn't always, result in board members, but you can begin conversations. Sometimes it's a cross conversation.
Okay. So we added about a little bit before the webinar.
Well, I just thought it was an interesting statement. It more quickly these days, and that change is happening more quickly. That was very current to me, and so when I saw this article, it's the title of it is, say the next 3 years will be more critical than the last half century. This is a survey of about 400 U.S. CEOs. The question that if the pace of business is moving this quickly and things are changing, what does this mean for the board? It means that in order for the boards to continue to oversee and add value to the company and the organization, they're going to need to be able to keep up with what their companies are doing. So it means to move to some additional expertise is going to be needed on them. And I think this need creates opportunities for more are otherwise qualified to sit on boards, depending on the industry and what's going on in the industry, perhaps looking at chief digital officers, again, based on the company's strategy and the risk. And I'm not even talking about cybersecurity here, which requires the board's attention. We also know that creativity is essential in today's competitive writings these days on the importance of creativity and how are being drawn into the business world because of their creative thinking. It's just essential in today's competitive world, and having technology is a significant part of that. I was fortunate to visit the offices of Dropbox the other day and found, these young people who were working. They were walking around with laptops and headphones, and they were stopping and sitting in rooms with nooks, or they would be out on the patio on the rooftop of the building doing their work. They were not sitting at desks or in cubicles or in offices. And the interesting is that the business had created an environment that, in their view, allowed their workers to be the most productive. It was really a beautiful thing.
That's really interesting. So when you talk about technology in today's marketplaces, does an organization get new tech-centric perspectives and expertise into their boardroom?
It doesn't always have to be tech-centric, but let's just talk about how vacancies, are going to occur. Slide is somewhat self-explanatory, but I think we ought to review it. So I read recently that to increase diversity on their boards, some boards are increasing their size to new members. And I also think in the case of planned retirements, increasing the size of the board to allow for some crossover with the new board member and the retiring board member may make sense for. But I always have to caution that you need to check the organization's bylaws or maybe the charter to see if that might be accomplished. Often bylaws will establish a range for the size of the board with the exact number to be determined by the board, so it may be fairly straightforward, but you always have to look at what. And then, of course, board evaluations and skills assessments are not specifically for the purpose of moving people off the board, but as I said a minute ago, the conversation that ultimately leads to board changes. Often that's why a third party may be brought in to conduct the board evaluation, because someone who has done this both from the in-house perspective and now as an outside third party governance consultant, the board members with an outside third party, then they would be with a colleague or someone from the company with whom they interact regularly, or some with whom they've worked on with others. So they are able to open up in a way that they couldn't otherwise when they're talking about either themselves or their. And then my colleague and I just finished a skills assessment with the board as I say, they plan for their upcoming retirements, and the resulting matrix to even learn more about their colleagues with whom they've worked on the board for a number of years. So that's that can also lead to conversation. People intend to be on the board, and whether they have the right skills for the board now, or should they be stepping aside. So these are effective ways of doing it. Of looking at how to create vacancies. And then what skills and experience are leaving the board is also relevant to. It may be the person on the board with the most experience in international M&A is leaving for some reason, and that's a significant part of the current strategy. So in that case, face that set of skills and experience, but maybe you're going to look for someone with more current experience than the person who's just leaving. And this isn't to do the work. That's management, and be able to appropriately test management's assumptions and make sure that they've explored all of the alternatives.
So I thinking about term limits. What are your feelings about term limits? That's a common question we get in our webinars.
Sure. Well, I mostly see profits where there's a need to regularly refresh the board. They don't typically have other mechanisms, and it may be in order to invite members to sit on a nonprofit. They say, well, it's only going to be for 5 years or something. So there's an end date in sight. There are some public companies that have term limits. It's not common. I think age limits and term limits are both really blunt instruments, because lose really productive members of the board by saying you can only be here for 5 years or 8 years, and then you have to leave. So I really like having these other kind of processes like board evaluations, and so that you can really get a sense as to the level of contribution each board member is making, rather than using term limits or age limits.
So, webinar, we were briefly chatting a little bit about a topic that I hadn't really thought about or explored before, and that's director independence and concentration. A very interesting discussion. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So we're talking about investor concerns, but they should organizations generally. But so even if you don't have investors, I think this is relevant. But those of you with public company backgrounds know that looking at board composition, it catches their attention when they see excessive executive compensation or company performance, investors will start focusing on, well, who's on the board? You know, how long have they been there? Or does the board have the right membership? And they also are concerned about, often when they see a combined chair, a CEO. And so when that occurs, it's really important to have a lead director to offset that. Is that it depends on the organization whether a combined chair CEO role is doable. I've worked in situations both had a separate CEO and a separate chair, or when the role has been combined. And in my experience, it depends very much on the personalities and the company. But dramatic if you've got this combined roles that there's going to be a problem. And so the way companies address that is that they will establish a lead director role who interacts with the next as a conduit for information to the chair CEO and helps with the agendas and so on. But there are other versions of concentrated power and inability to, if somebody is a very strong personality on the board and you know, doesn't consider other viewpoints and other input into the conversation. The point really is to have a board where reasonable dialogue on the issues can occur. And then you seek, and then ultimately you vote. And it's a majority rule. You know, it shouldn't be dominated by particular personalities. In the public company world, I say very active on board composition. They also question, some of them these days are questioning whether or not a director is really independent from management after a certain period of seeing limits being adopted. You know, they'll come up with formulas or say, after 12 years, we're not going to consider a director independent. Consequences, I mean, while it doesn't affect the technical, meeting whether or not the director meets the technical requirements of being independent, but if the investors view that the director therefore shouldn't, you know, be on any of the committees that requires all of the board members to be independent, it can be a challenge. So, as I say, my fast rules don't really work to solve the issue. And as I say, I think you can lose some very productive board members this way. So I think to counteract that, it's important to have these good, strong processes in place where the board itself is looking at its effectiveness, and you have, and let investors know that the board takes this all very seriously and has the matter in hand.
So, Chris, so far in the webinar, you know, we've looking for a composition that's technical, has skills and expertise, perspective, and now even can. So, what should organizations be looking for when they're recruiting, when they're looking for director candidates?
Yeah. Well, just think of the CEOs of some of the largest companies and some big investors, and I think, or they issued their statement recently about they've been working on coming up with some common sense principles of corporate governance online. There are a number of law firms that are, you know, sort of sending out their memos. Just Google common sense principles of corporate governance, and sort of they wanted people to just see what some fundamental ways of approaching things are. And one of the things I want to read briefly, it says that directors should have complementary and diverse skill sets, backgrounds, and experiences, diversity along multiple functioning board, and that director candidates should be drawn from a rigorously diverse pool. So I like that very much and encourage all to find that and take a look at all of the principles. And so I think there's an increase in opportunities, candidates, boards as a result of the increased turnover that is occurring. And we know from data that because there have been some long-standing members on the board, then the next few years that there are going to be more retirements. And, you know, boards have historically added retired executives when they have more time to devote to board service, and also bring their significant experience on the board. But going back to the pace of business trees, retired board members' experience can get stale fairly quickly. Now, that's not to say that they don't bring other qualities that can be very important. Their experience is very valuable and important, but their particular business experience may be stale. And as we know, there are also calls for increasing diversity, and this is diversity based on gender, race, or ethnicity, or sexual orientation, or experience. Paul, I've lost the slides. Are you still showing them?
I don't know if we had a technical issue or not.
I don't know, but I can continue on. I think that all candidates need to be qualified for the particular board seat, but so often, you know, board members have been, in the past at least, they've been selected because the people on the board, and so for comfort, that's what people have tended to gravitate towards. But increasingly, boards are being pressured to be more inclusive when they're considering candidates. I recently worked with a board made up of 50% women, and the men on the board said that having caused them to be more thoughtful in their decisions, and they were very happy with their board composition. And you know, we know that some companies now encourage very talented executives to consider outside board service for the experience and the perspective they gain from that. And these people will bring to they join, which is so important. And I think that the group is going to necessarily include some younger people and hopefully be a diverse group. Bottom line, I think the pool of available candidates then necessarily includes a younger and hopefully more diverse and more tech-savvy group of men and women they have long in their careers that they are board ready, but they've risen in their professions or even started their own businesses. I read something today even about how percentage of people who've joined boards in the last year this is their first board that they've joined. And I do want to comment on that, exactly what we're talking about. But I think it's really important when you bring someone onto a board who doesn't have prior board experience to really make sure that you have a rotation process to educate the boards. I've seen this happen before when somebody will join a board for the first time and they're not quite sure what their role is in their daily lives. And so they come onto a board thinking that they're supposed to manage, and that's absolutely not correct. Well, there are some boards that people are added to boards because there isn't management in the organization, and so we call this, so you're brought onto, maybe nonprofits, for example, may not have management expertise. They may not have management to do a lot of the work, and brought onto the board to do the work. I sat on a small nonprofit for a while, and they wanted a lawyer on the board, there was a CPA on the board, and he was the board's treasurer. We helped the organization with not its day-to-day, but we really helped. But on the other hand, most boards are the governing type of board. So when you bring a board member on, there is professional management who is very capable, and the role of the board then is one of oversight, to test management's assumption, to question that they're, doing the right stuff, that they're thinking about the right issues and so on, and that they have the right strategy. That's really like the most important, is management bringing the right strategy to the board and to the company at this time in the organization's history. So diverted a little bit there,
No, that was great. That was very interesting, and it's a good segue because of that. So, um, can you talk a little bit more, kind of related to that, around just the
Hmm.
process of the search for diverse candidates?
Sure. I think one way to think about looking for diverse candidates is to refine what you're looking for into the personal qualities or character, just, like a title, as I show here on the slide. This can really expand the universe considerably and result in candidates with diverse background or academia or, some international experience. And you can see from the example that you may think you want someone with CEO experience, but really, perhaps really looking for leadership experience, and of course that can come from many sources. And then also think about the context, and in other words, broaden the way you're thinking about the vacancy. And I have to say here, for prospect increasing number of providers out there who say they can get women or minorities on boards, or and they may require some payment to be part of a database, or to get training on how to be part of a board. So that, some of this is really quite legitimate, but I would just say for this type of service, I think you need to look very closely at their results and really check references to make sure that they can do what they say they're doing.
So, at the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned the need for boards to adapt to the technological organization.
Hmm.
Chris,
Hmm.
what about technology in the boardroom itself?
Well, I think we're board ready. Again, having the requisite qualifications and experience to sit on the board, I think they're just necessarily going to be more familiar with these than their predecessors, many of whom are on the boards currently. I think in part driven by the technological advances, the group is likely to better understand and use technology more easily out of the business world for a while. And I think they're going to expect it in boardrooms if they're asked to join. And individually, these people may have ways of working with forms of technology to increase their own effectiveness. Um, and smartphones and smartwatches and maybe Fitbits and, things like that. In my experience, if current board members are exposed to the newer technologies and educated properly about how to use them, they tend to embrace them. You don't always have access to current technologies. I think having kids helps there, but I did an interview with the chair of the, um, and we did FaceTime, and that was a great way to, I mean, she was across the country, and we used, Face. Terrific. I think also companies can do their boards a great service by bringing technology into the boardroom. And I worked with a pension fund organization, went to great lengths to bring in the latest technology into the boardroom so that the members could see presentations all around the room. It was a pretty good sized boardroom. They could hear the speakers better. That they had great tech support and education on how to use these things and what they needed to do. And we talked about on their board portal so that board members could view them at their leisure. And I just want to say, I recall when tablets were first gaining in popularity a few years ago now, the board members brought in his tablet, um, and everybody else still had their Blackberries. So the other board members wanted to touch it, and by the next meeting, two more directors had them. And I think with the advent of the tablets, with the popularity of, I think the other thing that happened was that board portal providers had to adapt their technology so that the board materials could be retrieved securely and so on. And then, from my perspective, it felt like it really reinvigorated the industry, and I think it created opportunities for new entrants. So, any questions?
reminder to our audience, if you have anything you'd like to ask Chris, you can please type it into, you should see on your screen. We do have a couple questions already. So this is a good one. So Chris, what role do you present? Basically, you know, executive level management, what role do they play in their interaction with the board around composition? Or do they play?
I think certainly the CEO is going to have some views about what he or she needs from the board, and I think in a good relationship, the way it's the CEO doesn't get a vote, but he or she can talk to the people on the nominating and governance committee or the board chair and talk about what would really enhance the overall effectiveness of the board. And so I think it's incumbent on the board to listen to the CEO. Again, if ultimately it's their decision, but you know, it's so important to have a good working relationship about these kinds of issues.
Thank you for that. So obviously board composition is going to be unique to the organization, to the market they serve, to their geographics. In your experience, is there any kind of ratio that should be looked at, whether it's new directors to more tech-savvy directors to perhaps expertise in some other areas? Is there any kind of ratio or alignment that is unique from board to board?
Well, I very much think it depends on the board and what the situation is and what the strategy is, but there are some that really like to see a ratio of, they like a third of newer directors, a third of directors who've been there for a while, and a third of the board being on for a while, for you know, longer than the ones in the middle, because, and the notion is that you have this sort of constant learning that goes on, and at the same time you have fresh. But I don't think, again, that there are any hard and fast rules. I think I would always want to come back to having good, strong processes. Maybe times when the board is exactly where it needs to be and it should remain static for a while. And then something comes along that takes place that changes the direction of the business, you know, and so then it's time to take a look and say, add some additional experience here. So again, it's not always about replacing board members if there's the ability to expand the board a little bit. Our board has been a little bit too small, and so the demands on the board members can be a lot, especially with committee requirements. So, you know, you can look at studies and see what other companies think is an optimum when you're looking at your own. So that's you know, another way to get a sense of what other people are doing. There are a lot of studies out there where either Spencer Stewart or KPMG and Society for Corporate Governance, NACD, that look at these kinds of issues, and so resources to consider.
So thank you. Here's a related question. So are you aware of any, we were talking about the webinar, are you aware of any kind of baseline assessments that are available that will help a board determine if they have the different skills and traits that we've been talking about today?
So the way to think about the skills is usually through a skills assessment, where that can either be part of the board evaluation separately. I know one company does it separately from the board assessment. So, well, in private as well, there's always this annual election of your directors, or when it comes time to elect. Participation of the annual meeting and thinking about electing directors. A lot of people, if you sort of back into that, there's advance of that to think about who's going to be nominated to be on the board? And have we gone through a process whereby we're sure members for the board? And so often before you get to that point, there will be a board evaluation and or a skills evaluation. Not long ago, where while it wasn't a formal part of the board evaluation process, I looked at it and realized that they had 3 accountants on the board, for example, and this was not the kind of company really spoke to their process about adding board members. And so I talked to them about that. It was, in this case, it was the side who he felt would be a good member without a more objective process. So I think the board evaluation, I like to think that it's not a basic, sort of check the box kind of thing. I think if you can tailor the board evaluation to the particular board. Skills assessments are other things. Again, you could see Denise's example. Look at what skills and competencies are most important, do the board think are most important for that company, that industry. People think are important for their boards, but you really have to think about your own. And then you can go through an exercise where the board members feel that they have experience in the area. Do they feel that they're experts in the area, or maybe they are just literate in that area? They have some familiarity with the area, but they feel that their knowledge is basic, and so you wouldn't view that as being, you wouldn't consider them to be an expert in the area by any means. Some areas that most boards want to have, you want to have financial expertise on all boards, right? You want to have some industry experience on all boards, but then whether the next area is marketing, maybe that's a very important area for that industry. So that, I think they have to be, at the end of the day, they have to be kind of individualized, tailored.
Okay.
Does that help, Paul?
Much. Chris, we're going to wrap up our webinar today. It's just at the 45-minute mark. Thank you so much today. I appreciate your time. Very interesting conversation. For our audience out there, you see contact information here on the screen. If you have any quicks that were reviewed in today's presentation, or just, questions, need to talk about corporate governance in general, you see Chris's at the Veaco Group. Again, Chris, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. We will be having another one next month of how the best boards are made. Thank you again, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you very much, Paul.